Hello and welcome to In Control, the first podcast on control theory. Here we discuss the science of feedback, decision-making, artificial intelligence, and much more. I'm your host, Alberto Paduan, live from a recording studio in Vancouver and Hyderabad. Quick thanks to our sponsors, the National Centre of Competence in Research on Dependable Ubiquitous Automation. Our guest today is Mathukumalli Vidyasagar, Distinguished Professor in the Department of Artificial Intelligence at IIT Hyderabad. Welcome to the show, Sagar.
Thank you very much.
So, Sagar, it's an honor to have you here on the show. I really enjoyed preparing this episode and going through the list of publications and books that you've written. I would probably start actually with something that struck me on your website. I really like the quote, "Research should be fun." How did you think of putting that on your website?
Well, if you look at that photo, when I had that photo taken, I guess I was probably about 64 or 65. Now I'm 77. So that was about 12 years ago. And if you look at that photo, I have lots of crow's feet. Okay. And somebody commented. But the point is that if you forget the crow's feet, I'm actually laughing in that photo. So I wanted people looking at the website to say, forget the crow's feet, I'm having fun. That's what research should be about. So some people seem to like the tagline. So I left that web page as it was without changing. You're not the first one to comment on that. And I don't understand why more well-accomplished researchers don't tell graduate students that research has to be fun. It can't be a drudgery.
It's such a simple statement, such an obvious one, but sometimes we may forget, I guess. Okay, Sagar, I just wanted to maybe start with understanding where did you grow up and how did that affect who you became today?
Yes, so I was living in India till the year 1960. My father was a professor of mathematics, and I have a sister who was 4 years younger than I am. And so in 1960, my father, mother, myself, and my younger sister, we all moved to the US. And at that point, I wasn't quite 13, I was still 12. And but I was kind of precocious. I was already in the Indian 12th standard. So when I went to the US, initially they looked at this 12-year-old kid and tried to put me in 7th standard. Now, fortunately, my father had the foresight to take my school textbooks along with me. So they looked at this book and said, okay, you're not 7th standard, 8th, 9th standard. Finally, I wound up back in 12th standard again in the US. So I graduated the next year from high school. Again, I was not quite 14, I was 13, and I started university. So my father was at the University of Missouri, and because I had graduated from an American high school, I could get admission to the university directly. There was no SAT or any of those requirements. And the bonanza was that because my father was a professor, I even got free tuition. Then after 3 years, my father had to leave because he was on the so-called exchange visitors visa. So my mother and I spent 1 year in Wisconsin, where my mother did a master's in library science. And then she went back to Canada, where my father had moved to. So at the age of 17, I was living alone, probably violating all kinds of rules. I don't think you're supposed to live alone if you're not officially an adult, but anyway, nobody seemed to have paid any attention to that. So then I finished my bachelor's, and at the University of Wisconsin, I was the top student in the College of Engineering. So they gave me their best fellowship without me even applying for it. They just said, okay, here's your fellowship. I said, okay. So I asked my father, what should I do? And he said, well, Wisconsin is a good university, and they're treating you so nicely, so why don't you just stay there? So I did. The reason why I'm giving you this long story, I never wrote the GRE either. Most people who want to go to graduate study, they have to write the GRE, but I never did. So in some ways, I had a bit of a charmed life because I never wrote any competitive exams, neither the SAT to get into undergraduate, nor the GRE to get into graduate studies. I just carried on. So then I taught 1 year at Marquette University in Milwaukee. And by this time, my parents and sister were settled in the city of Edmonton, Canada. So I moved to Montreal and spent the next 19 years in Canada, 10 years in Montreal and 9 years in Waterloo. Then I moved back to India in 1989. Basically, I've been here ever since. So I've changed my job every 10 years approximately.
Which is fantastic, actually, because when I was preparing the episode, it really goes by decade almost. There's decades in your life.
Well, yes, I have to tell you something else too. When I just first moved to Montreal in 1970, I read this book, which is a biography of David Hilbert by a lady called Constance Reed. And it's a fantastic book because it gives a real insight into Hilbert the mathematician. Now, the interesting thing is this lady, Constance Reed, she was not a mathematician. She was not mathematically trained, but somehow she managed to capture the essence of Hilbert the man and the mathematician. And one of the points she mentioned was that Hilbert would change his areas drastically every 3 or 4 years. So I said, okay, I'll also try to do the same thing. Now, when I say this to people, they say, come on, you're not Hilbert. I know I'm not Hilbert. I mean, that's obvious. So the saying I have invented is, discover your inner Hilbert. Right? So you change areas every 3, 4 years and you do the best you can. And another thing that somebody said to me, this is when I was about 30 years and I was explaining my philosophy. Somebody said, you think that in 3, 4 years you can solve all the problems in the research area? I said, no, but I think I'll solve all the research problems that I am ever going to solve in the research area. Because what happens is that after about 3 or 4 years, you tend to fall into a rut and you start trying to repeat your earlier successes. Whereas when you change areas, you have to start afresh because you don't understand the subject. You have to pick up the background. And it's very humbling experience because nobody in the new community knows who you are. So your comfort level drops down quite a bit. But then by the time I finished getting on top of the new area, I found that I had a really deep understanding of the new area. And a lot of times what happened is people who have been in the same area for 10, 15 years, they fall into some standard thought patterns. So somebody coming from the outside often has the ability to disrupt those thought patterns and come up with something new and original. And this is what I think I've been able to do. I've probably changed about 7, 8 areas, maybe more. I have written now 13 books and writing a 14th book now. My guess is this is going to be my last book because, I'm sort of getting up in years. So after this next book, I'll probably call it quits, you can say.
And I could argue that almost every book, at least that I've read, is a Bible on the subject. It's been a wonderful journey for me to read about your work in general. As you say, you started as an enfant prodige, also as the son of famous mathematician Subarao, working in number theory, which gives you an Erdős number of 3, if I am not mistaken.
I spent a lot of time on the exposition part because you have to make it easy for the reader. You're not writing the book for yourself, you're writing the book for the reader. And many people actually forget that. And the way most of my books come about is, remember I said I changed my areas drastically. So when I change the area drastically, I don't understand anything. So I keep reading these books and papers. It's kind of chaotic. I mean, you know very well. You pick up a new area, no two people have the same notation, no two people have the same terminology. So I try to make notes for myself what is actually going on here. And the other thing I did was, and I still continue to do, I don't look for a reference until I have tried to work something out for myself. So what I mean by that is, I say book. and it says theorem XYZ. Then I said, well, okay, let me not read the proof because this author is saying theorem, it must be true. But let me see if I can find out the proof on my own. And only if I'm really, really stuck, I go and read the proofs. And this I found helped me to get a much deeper understanding of the subjects because I was working out everything on my own. So sometimes I actually had a better proof than what was in the books I read. And sometimes I had worse proofs. That's fine. So when I had a better proof, I wanted an outlet for presenting this better proofs. You see, in our research community, there is no natural outlet for simple proofs. See, you cannot publish a research paper saying here is this well-known theorem, but look, I found this really beautiful proof. Nobody cares. But when you write a book and you string together all these simpler proofs, and of course you unify the notation across maybe 100 or 200 papers, then the readers appreciate that. And the third tip, which I actually got from Professor Charlie Desoer, was that make your book modular. Even in 1973, 74, he told me the days of people reading the book from cover to cover are over. People want to look into a book, jump in, look up whatever they want, and jump back out again. So you have to make it easy for them. So, for example, what it means is if you say theorem, it has to be completely self contained. A kind of a very poor practice some authors have it. They'll say, throughout this chapter, we make the following assumptions. And 20 pages later, there is a theorem which is using those assumptions, but they haven't reminded anybody. So a novice, and remember, a lot of times my books, I think, are read by PhD students also, not just professors. A novice gets confused by this because they look at the theorem and nowhere has it been mentioned that those assumptions are assumed in this theorem. So I take a lot of care to make sure that each theorem statement is very self-contained. Now you don't have to repeat the text. You can just say we assume that assumptions A1 through A5 hold. That's good enough. Because then the reader will say, oh, what are A1 through A5? They'll go and look it up. But the dreadful approach is throughout this chapter, we assume that A1 through A5 hold, and you never mention it again. That's really confusing for a reader.
I agree.
So I have evolved over the years a kind of style with which I feel comfortable. And I just stick to that basically.
And the style is very transparent. It's nice that you mentioned also Charlie Desoer. That's the first book that you've written, right, in 75, if I understand correctly.
Well, the first book was published in 75. And he was also very clear in writing. And the other thing he was very particular was that your notation has to be very, very transparent. That means by looking at the symbol, the reader should know what it means. So don't use some weird symbols and have to constantly go back 10 pages, 15 pages to look up what this thing means. Right? Mm-hmm. And there is a series of articles. It's called How to Write Mathematics. So one of the articles was by Paul Halmos. And Halmos, of course, is very famous for his very, very clear writing. And he talks about the same thing that Charlie talked about, namely that notation has to be very, very transparent. The reader should not be forced to go back every time to figure out what does this symbol mean. And finding good notation, it's an art. I mean, it doesn't come automatically. See, mathematically, you can call a symbol whatever you want. It doesn't make any difference to the mathematics. But it does impact the comprehension of what you have written by the reader. That's what we have to remember.
I'm curious, how did you meet Professor Desoer and how did you decide to write the book?
Oh, he actually called me. I invited him to Montreal where I was teaching. I wrote, here's another story I want to tell you about Charlie. So I invented the so-called stable factorization method. And that was my first big result. And I was pretty young at the time, 23. So, and I was brash enough that I wrote this paper and sent it off to Professor Desoer because I had generalized one of his papers, right? And believe it or not, about 8 to 10 days later, and this is no email, nothing back then. It's his conventional post. About 8 to 10 days later, he sent a letter saying your paper is very nice and suggesting a whole bunch of changes, minor changes. So uh, then after that, became very bold and invited into Montreal to give a lecture. So then he told me during that visit that he had been trying to write this book on feedback stability, but he was not finding the time. So would I be willing to join his project and help him to finish the book? So obviously I considered it an honor, right? So that's how it happened. So he chose me, but he influenced a lot of my style of exposition for sure.
We could say that he was some sort of I mean, I've seen in the preface of your following book on nonlinear systems analysis that you actually have a passage saying, though I was not privileged to be one of his PhD students, I was fortunate enough to have come under his influence while still in a formative stage in my career. Any instances of originality, creativity, and clarity in my research and exposition are but pale imitations of his shining example. Amazing.
Yes, that's what I wrote in the second edition of the Nonlinear Systems book. And that's exactly what I'm trying to tell you, that it really influenced me a lot, even though he was not my official PhD supervisor.
And in fact, so during, let's say, the decade that goes from 1971 to 1980, you are at Concordia in Montreal and you write 3 influential books, one on feedback systems, input-output properties, nonlinear systems analysis, and then input-output analysis of large-scale interconnected systems.
Yeah, the third one wasn't that influential, but the nonlinear systems analysis book survived for many decades as a standard book. And the book by Charlie, with Charlie, is still cited even today. So what happened was that I was asked to teach a course in nonlinear systems. And I didn't want to mention the name because I don't want to sound critical. There was one book that was terrible, I mean, absolutely dreadful. And I said, we can't use this book, it's full of mistakes. Then I said, well, okay, let's find other books which are, that was the prescribed book, by the way. And I said, okay, forget about it. Let's see if we can find other books. And I found, to my surprise, that nobody really had a precise analysis of nonlinear system. So when I was a graduate student and my first few years of teaching, nonlinear systems was treated like a bag of tricks, that it wasn't really amenable to rigorous analysis. So my nonlinear systems book was actually an attempt to get rid of this misconception that it's not a bag of tricks. You can actually say some very, very precise things about nonlinear systems.
I believe it. That's actually how reviews describe it. It's a book that clearly presents difficult topics, but demystifying the fact that it's actually difficult to analyze the nonlinear behaviors using certain tools. Let's say describing functions, for example, L2 gain, and tools of the like. I was wondering, how did you decide to write a book on, let's say, one of the next books on the factorization approach that you were mentioning before?
So that is one of the more interesting things because it actually happened from reviewing a paper. I forgot who the editor was for the automatic control transactions, but there is a paper by Desoer, Leo, Murray, and Sachs, okay, 4 authors. And it was fairly abstract, and nobody could understand it because it was using a lot of abstract algebra. So the associate editor, and I can't remember who it was, asked me, will you review this paper? And as soon as I looked at it, I realized it's a profound paper, even if it was difficult to understand. So then I spent a lot of time and I basically cleaned up the approach considerably. I mean, this is the technical audience, so I can tell you a technical explanation. So in that paper, they said the set of all stable systems is a non-commutative ring, and the set of unstable systems is a bigger non-commutative ring. That was very, very unsatisfactory. So what I did was, and that's what is in the stable factorization book, I said that the set of stable system is a commutative ring. and multi-input, multi-output systems are matrices over this ring. So yes, there's non-commutativity, but it got nothing to do with the ring. It's got to do with the fact that matrix multiplication is not commutative. Right? And secondly, what is an unstable system? Well, the unstable system is the field of fractions associated with the ring of stable system. And then the last thing was you are not stuck on rational transfer functions. This approach works for even irrational transfer functions. So that was the point of that book. So I accepted the book by Charlie and Company. It appeared. But then with Bruce Francis and myself, we rewrote this whole theory. And that led to the stable factorization route, which I think is fairly influential even now. Because, I mean, the subject has moved on, but I don't think there is any a more general treatment than that would.
Yeah, I read about this example where you have the transfer function with cosh of S that you can then factorize as, what is it? 1 over cosh of S.
Yeah. These LC transmission lines, which are, people didn't know what to do with them. And because the standard example that eigenvalues in the left half plane doesn't make any sense. So they didn't know what to do. So the stable factorization approach gives you very precise framework for handling.
And it's the same circle of ideas that has led also to the Euler-Kucera parametrization that essentially allows you to search.
Yeah, so the Euler-Kucera parametrization was already there, except what Euler had was he had a mix-up of transfer function and polynomials. So it was not a very clean theory. So but by doing it this way, the stable systems form a ring and unstable systems are the associated fraction field. The whole notion of copran factorization, characterizing all the stabilizer controller, which is what Euler's main contribution was. That came out very cleanly. And then the other thing like simultaneous stabilization. When can you find a controller that will stabilize two completely unrelated systems? So these kind of things come very naturally. And the last thing with Bruce, because Bruce Francis proved the internal model principle in his PhD thesis, but that was a polynomial case, rational transfer function. So we figured out how to do it for the distributed parameter systems.
And Bruce Francis was also based in Canada at that time, right?
He was actually based in Waterloo from 81 to 84. He was there when we worked this out. And then in 84, he moved from Waterloo to Toronto. So, but by then we had already finished this work. So my book appeared in 85.
And one thing I learned is that, I mean, again, in the preface of this book, it's something that I didn't know, the origin of the name Diophantine equation, well, matrix equation or Bezout identity. You have something, an interesting take on how it should be called.
No, I'll tell you, it's called Aryabhatta's identity. Of course, very difficult name for foreigners to pronounce.
Yeah.
So this Aryabhatta was born in 476 AD. I guess now they call it 476 Common Era. So he actually wrote this treatise, which still exists. I mean, you can read the original. And the way he was looking at solutions of equations were a little different. In my book, I was saying ax plus by equals 1. He didn't look at it that way. What he wanted to say was, so you are given A, Y, and B, and you want to find AX equals Y mod B. It's the same equation rewritten. AX equals Y mod B means that AX equals BY, right? Plus 1. So then what he did, and this is the key, he said once you have found one solution, how do you find all solutions? Now, I just want to tell you again, because the audience is technical, the reason why Aryabhatta wrote the identity in that manner was because you don't need negative numbers. You see, if you say AX equals Y mod B, then you see, you can ask for everything to be non-negative numbers. But if you say AX plus BY equals 1, and A and B are positive numbers, at least X or Y has to be a negative number. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So that was a very clever idea of Aryabhatta to find a way around the negative number. They had the idea of negative numbers even in 476. But he wrote the equation in this way. And what he said was that once you find one solution, you just add all multiples of B and you get all solutions. Which, if you want to put it that way, is in fact the germ of the Euler parameterization. Right?
Amazing. I personally didn't know it about before reading the preface of your book. The one that we're talking about just for the audience is Control Systems Synthesis, a Factorization Approach, part 1 and 2, obviously. I don't know, I found it particularly interesting. Also, as we mentioned, the book goes quite in the depths of an algebraic approach to synthesis of controllers. Something that we didn't mention is also the graph metric that is also appearing in the book.
Yeah. So the issue was, what do you mean by two unstable systems are close to each other? And before we got to that, the only way was if you just take the standard x dot equals a to bu type of thing. You just perturb a and b, this new system is close to the old system. But what this method does not allow is order uncertainty. So how do you say a 10th order system is close to a third order system? So that's where you need the graph metric, because you look at the stable factorizations and you have a way of computing, or at least estimating, the metric that quantifies rather a proximity of one unstable system to another one of a different order. And then I should mention here that Trifon Giorgio and Malcolm Smith have done a lot of work on this using the so-called gap metric, which is equivalent. So that's the reason for thinking of that idea.
And I should mention that I read a delightful paper on the European Journal of Control called A Brief History of the Graph Topology, which is an account not only of how this idea originated, but also in general, it seems to be to refer, if you want, to your own trajectory. I found it particularly fascinating in many ways because you don't just talk about it, but you also, give advice to future generations. If you want, we can also talk about it later. Generally, I ask questions to our audience about how future generations should operate. And there you're very prescriptive.
Yeah, I don't remember if I mentioned how I thought about the last missing link in that troop when my wife and I were out shopping. Did I mention that? I don't recall.
I think you did. Yeah, you do. And I think the audience actually should know about it. Why don't we tell that story?
Okay, so in India, women wear these things called the sari. You drape it around yourself. And usually these saris are silk or some mixture of silk and cotton. And the blouse, which is the top part, is cotton because India is a hot country, so the cotton absorbs the sweat. So my wife wanted to buy some blouse pieces for her sari. So we went to a shop. And so these shops, they look like paint shops, meaning you have maybe 1,000 bolts of cloth of various colors. And so what the ladies do, they take this piece of cloth and keep comparing it against all these bolts of cloth, okay? And because the sari is silk and the blouse is cotton, one thing you can guarantee is that there is not going to be a match because the texture of silk is very different from the texture of cotton. So there are a lot of fun comparing one after the other. So that's what she was doing. And I started thinking about this problem. And then it suddenly occurred to me how to fix my last link. So I guess the moral of the story is be a good husband and you'll get great ideas for your research.
I'm better in mind for myself.
We have been married for 52 years now.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And in this paper, you're very prescriptive about, for example, how do researchers aspire to excellence? How should they behave? Be patient, humble, work simply, and interact widely. I found that particularly fascinating. I was wondering, so you mentioned that you changed field several times, or at least domain of interest. I was wondering what brought you to robotics or towards robotics?
Actually, that was a very hot topic after I finished this stable factorization do, and I was looking for a new topic. And so robotics was kind of hot. And as usual, I didn't know anything about robotics, nothing. So then there was this book by Richard Paul. That was the only book in robotics. It was very difficult to read. So I spent a sabbatical leave in GE corporate R&D in Schenectady. And Mark Spong was there for 2 months. So then I discovered that Mark was also writing a book in robotics. So I said, and the way I learn a new subject is by preparing notes. Sometimes they become a book, sometimes they don't. But I was writing these notes. And so Mark and I started talking. And one thing that we noticed was that our styles were very similar, meaning we could combine the two manuscripts without a whole lot of trouble. You can find W-authored books where it's very clear who wrote which piece. But with the Mark and me, it was not like that. We blended very comfortably. So then we started looking at robotics. And I got onto this notion of a flexible robots. And then there we kind of divided. Mark was writing about robots with flexible joints, and I was working on robots with flexible links. And both of them are applications of feedback linearization theory that had just come. If your audience can look up, the first paper on feedback linearization was in 1981. It showed how to take a nonlinear systems. Hansu and Meyer wrote the paper. And how to take a nonlinear system and make it linear through state feedback and coordinate transformation. So Mark showed that when you have flexible joints, you can use that approach. And with one of my students, I could show that if you have flexible links, you can use that approach.
And the student being David Wang, am I understanding correctly?
David Wang, yeah. So he basically took my job when I came back to India.
I did read a sequence of papers actually on the subject. I found it very interesting. Also, you wrote a Control Systems magazine piece on systems theory and robotics and the opportunities for control, if you want, in the realm of robotics. Found that also fascinating because it seems like reading it today, so many of the points that you bring up in that paper are still valid. I'm not sure whether you're following now the trend on soft robotics and basically the challenges there. So many are essentially shared with the idea of having flexible joints, flexible links. Of course, I guess now the interest is really on distributed systems. But in that paper itself, you already talk about it very explicitly.
Yes. And with the big change in robotics from then to now is the under-actuated robots. So that means you have a lot of robotic joints which don't have any actuator, there's just free hinges. So even though I had no role in any of this, the big advance was how to generalize feedback linearization theory when you have under-actuated robots. So that, see, if you want to have a singing, dancing robot, and if you have a joint, every joint has to have an actuator, that robot would never move. It's just too heavy. So the fact that you can actually control a robot which has got lots of free hinges and only limited number of actuators, now that was the key. That's what people like Mark Spong or Jesse Grizzle, Francisco Bullo, these people all worked out all those. I'm sure I'm missing out a few others, but these are typical people who worked out all the theory. So when you see these Sony dancing robots, and they are the ones who gave the theoretical foundations. Right?
I guess chronologically here we're situated in time between 1989 and 2000. So I was wondering, and I see that in the records that you were responsible basically for running the Center of AI in Robotics in Bangalore. I was wondering whether that was also an inspiration for these research endeavors.
So that was my opportunity to come back to India. I could have come back as a professor, but this looked like a very good opportunity to start a center from the ground up. And it was called Center for Artificial Intelligence in Robotics. And there again, I had no idea what AI was. I knew what robotics was, but I didn't know what AI was. And in those days, late 80s, early 90s, it was just rule-based expert systems, logic programming, things of this nature. So we hired some good scientists, started building some robots. But one of the key challenges was that the Indians were building their own fighter plane. And the question was, how do you control this unstable fighter plane? So an unstable plane is more maneuverable than a stable plane. But that's why you want to design a plane to be statically unstable. But our guys, meaning Indian Air Force, were very nervous about building an unstable plane. So we use modern control theory, especially things like simultaneous stabilization, H infinity control. And then the notion of randomized algorithms for guaranteeing stability came out of that work. So that's actually a great achievement for us, the Indian community, because the Indian fighter plane called Tejas, which the first fighter plane in history to be inducted into operational service without crashing even once. So every other plane has crashed at least once. So that was a testament to our control law. Yeah.
It's nice that you mentioned also the randomized approaches, because I guess it would have been the next question or set of topics that I would have basically wanted to discuss. I found that also we're talking about, well, a couple of books at least, and a series of papers that you've written on the subject. Perhaps the most eminent one being Randomized Algorithms for Robust Controller Synthesis Using Statistical Learning Theory, that also received an award by Automatica. I'm very curious, how did your interest originate in the subject?
So it actually originated, as I was explaining, in the design of the controller for a Legion fighter plane. And because the uncertainty profile was very messy, no analytical solution was possible. So we just had to sample points in the uncertainty space. And then based on, okay, if your controller stabilizes all these sampled points of your uncertain plan, with what confidence can you say that it stabilizes over the entire uncertainty zone? And that was a natural problem for statistical learning theory. People call it all kinds of things now in machine learning. They call it empirical risk minimization. That's really what it is, an early instance of that. So that's what happened there. And it was fairly successful. And then the decisive thing there was Roberto Tempo, who unfortunately left us too early. He invited me to Torino to give a bunch of lectures. He had a good team there. I mean, he had Fabrizio, the Bene, Giuseppe Calafiori, all these guys were there. It was really fun to lecture to those guys. And it forced me to, I mean, as I told you several times, it forced me to organize my own ideas so that I have to make it clear to these people. And so at the end of all that, I think I had a good way of explaining this. So I wrote it up for Automatica, and it got, as you mentioned, it got the best paper prize. So, but Roberto had a very large role in that actually.
Yeah, so essentially the gist of that paper, at least the way I read it, was that there's several intractable problems that are NP hard, and in particular, as you say, obtaining guarantees with confidence, like using, let's say, classical tools such as H infinity control is sometimes in practice hard. And the way you bypass that difficulty is that if you want to generalize and say something about the performance on your controller based on samples, one tool you can use is the Vapnik-Chernoff dimension, because that allows you to say what, through a certain property. What I remember it being is the UCEM property, so uniform convergence of empirical means.
That's the key.
Okay.
That whole theory of statistical learning is based on uniform convergence of MP, meaning that every single estimate is within a prescribed accuracy of the correct answer. So that was in the world of mathematics or probability, it's called Vapnik-Chernoff theory. So what I did was to figure out how to apply that theory to our problem.
Essentially, that tells you what is the minimum number of samples that you need to obtain to say with a prescribed confidence that the probability of success is, let's say, a certain number.
No, it doesn't give you the minimum number. Actually, it's very conservative. What it tells you is that if you take this many samples, you're guaranteed with a certain confidence to get the right answer. And one of the open problems is now 2 decades old, that paper, 2.5 decades, is that lots of practical simulations show that all the bounds you get from a VC dimension theory are too high. But nobody has figured out a way of getting guaranteed convergence. So there's a big gap between numerical simulations and the guaranteed theory. It doesn't seem to be easy to bridge that gap. So if somebody is listening and wants to find a good research problem, one more open problem. Yeah. So in that book, the statistical learning theory book, I actually put 16 open problems because I thought it's a nice way to do my Hilbert imitation that free. And a few of them have been solved.
I guess the book that we're referring to now is the 1997 book, A Theory of Learning and Generalization, if I understand.
Yeah, theory of learning and generalization. And the last chapter has some open problems in it.
Amazing. My curiosity here is it here in time that your interest sparks, if you wish, in concerning learning and the subject of learning at large? So, for example, neural networks and what became today also machine learning as a collection of activities, let's say.
So that started in the late 80s, early 90s, because neural networks were very new. And people would make a vague statement like, neural networks can generalize. And I would say, what do you mean? They would say stuff like, oh, if you train it and then you show it an input it hasn't seen before, it gives you the right answer. Then I would say stuff like, always? That would kind of stump them. And they say, well, no, don't ask questions like that. They seem to work in practice. Well, that for the theoretician, it's not a satisfactory answer. So then again, I was talking about how listening to others is a stimulant. So at the Indian Institute of Science, there were two seminars about 1 month apart. The first seminar was that Professor Ravi Kannan, who was at that time at Yale University. Now he's in Bangalore in the Microsoft Research Labs. And a month later, Professor Sanjay Mitra, who puts no more, he gave a talk, and both these people were talking about VC dimension. I'd never heard of it. I said, oh, this sounds very interesting. And I realized that that was the right mathematical abstraction of what does it mean for a neural network generalized. Namely, it doesn't give you the exact answer. It gives you more or less the right answer most of the time. So this phrase, probably approximately correct, is exactly the right way to describe it. It probably gives you the answer, and the answer is only approximately correct, it's not exact. So once I decided to adopt gut formalism, everything sort of fell into place. And at about that time, when I was writing this book, Eduardo Sonntag was also thinking about along similar lines. So we kept exchanging emails and all that. So I mean, the point I'm trying to make is, you asked about interacting widely. I wrote in that a brief history of the graph topology. The reason why I'm mentioning all these names is to tell the audience that, look, all these people had an influence on the way I think about problems. I learned a lot from them. They triggered some thought process, and that helps me to be a better researcher. That's what I meant by saying interact widely.
Interaction is really key to generating new ideas, essentially.
Generating new ideas and also improve your own understanding. For example, I mentioned the lectures that Roberto asked me to give in Italy. So the guys were very bright, the ones that I mentioned, they didn't know anything about the subject. So I had to say, okay, what is it I'm trying to teach these people? So that forced me to work through the subject and figure out what I'm trying to say.
From this period in time, I also found particularly fascinating another paper, well, a series of papers, but I guess my favorite are analog neural networks better than binary neural networks. Because there's a dynamical systems perspective on basically, let's call it neural optimization. And there you look at the equilibrium property and the attractivity property. So whether there is a maximum or whether a local maximum is a fixed point and whether a local maximum has a basis of attraction. And you show that binary, essentially, somehow binary networks can often fail the latter. So even when initialized close to a global maximum, they may miss it. And so that's why analog neural networks in principle are better at generalizing. That's the way I understood it, at least.
No, you're absolutely right. I'm a little bit disappointed with that paper, and not the paper itself, but the lack of reception that it deserved, I think. Because I gave a complete theory of when you can solve discrete optimization problems using continuous neural networks. But somehow the research community didn't pay as much attention as it should have. And probably because I published in the AC transactions. Maybe if I tried to publish in the neural net transaction, it might have got better reception. Who knows? So that is one of the results that's not in my learning theory book. That's another problem as well. I didn't include it in my learning theory book.
Well, I agree. It's a true gem, this paper. I was wondering, what are the consequences of that paper for technology, in the sense that should we be using analog networks then?
So the technological implications are, you must remember that I wrote the paper in the early 90s. So at that point, people were using Hopfield networks. So Hopfield networks are discrete networks. And at each iteration, you go from the current state to the adjacent state. And it's easier. So if you have n binary variables, the number of states is 2 to the power of n. And it's easy to write examples. I wrote it in some paper, I forget which one, where if you use a Hopfield network and you use just the right objective function, the trajectory goes all over the place and explores every single one of the 2 to the power of n words before finally reaching the correct answer. So in principle, by using an analog neural network, because you're simultaneously adjusting all the parameters, you can get there more quickly. I had another paper which I never actually published. This paper you're talking about, it's like x squared equals f of x, where f had a bounded gradient. But it turns out that if you take x squared equals f of x and f is discontinuous, so then you have a sort of weird result which says that you can converge the solution of the problem arbitrarily fast. Now, the problem with that technologically is that when you start converging arbitrarily fast, if you introduce any noise, these kind of results don't hold anymore. But at a conceptual level, it's very useful to think of the problem in this way. So basically trying to say, as you said just now, think about analog neural networks as a genuine alternative to the sequential optimization like Hopfield network. That was the point of that paper.
There's a lot of, or at least I've been following the neuromorphic technologies recently with interest. And I guess the idea there is precisely that of using analog machines in order to perform inference tasks. So it seems like, at least this paper that I read, provides some theoretical basis in favor of using these kind of devices now.
Yeah, if you follow it up, I think that would be very beneficial to the research community because I'm basically not opening up any new fronts because I'm trying to wind my activities down. But yes, I think neuromorphic networks are more easy to analyze using continuous dynamics and vector fields rather than discrete optimization.
Okay, now I'm curious because, again, chronologically, as you say, you moved to India, you ran this center for approximately 10 years, and then you move on to Tata Consultancy in Hyderabad, where you're currently based. I was wondering, how did that also come about?
So that happened in a very simple way. So when I was the director of the center, my director general, the head of all the entire defense research organization, was a very legendary man called Dr. Abdul Kalam, who later became president of India. Very inspiring figure. And then when he finally retired, he was replaced by somebody whom I didn't like. So I tried to figure out what to do. So I wrote to the CEO of Tata Consultancy because I knew him well. And I wrote him a letter, a real letter, not emailed, saying that here are a bunch of technologies that I have developed in the last 10 years, which could be useful to Tata. Maybe 4 or 5 days later, I got a call from his secretary, and she says, Mr. Ramdare wants to talk to you. I said, okay. Then his first words were, so when are you starting? I said, wait a minute, what do you want me to do? And his answer was classic. No, we'll worry about it later. That was his answer. So in other words, his philosophy It's an excellent philosophy, by the way. So good person is available, grab him or her. Worry about what to do later. Don't try to fit people into predetermined silos and say, well, this is not quite what I had. Don't do gap filling. See a good person, just grab them. That's it. So then over the next 3 to 4 months, we sort of positioning myself, what should my center do, and so forth. And we did a whole bunch of things. We did security. Just on this Mozilla browser was coming, Firefox. And it wasn't very good for Indian languages, for rendering Indian languages on the screen. So my team did that. Then we had the so-called digital public key infrastructure. We built that. And then we got into computational biology because in 2001, the human genome was sequenced. And everybody felt that there was a lot of money to be made. And so my CEO said, what do you think? Is there a lot of money to be made? I said, I'm not sure. But let's make a small investment. We hired about 30 people and watch for maybe 2 years. And if we don't make any money, you, meaning my CEO, you have to be ready to write off the investment. And I said, okay, that's fine. See, I mean, that's again an important difference between a genuine leader and this kind of a penny pinching MBA types, right? That I told him that don't go put a big team that I have no idea if we'll make any money or not. But I'm telling you, your downside risk is 100%. Meaning at the end of 2 years, you may just have to write off the whole investment. He said, it's okay. He's not worried. But the number of people was only 30 people. And as it turned out, we made some money for the company directly, but we made a lot of money indirectly. Because the fact that we had a biology team differentiated us from other Indian software companies. So we got a lot of contracts from pharmaceutical companies and so on because we could understand their language and their requirements.
And in all of this, you continue to be active also on the research front, and this culminates in another book, 2014, Hidden Markov Processes, Theory and Applications to Biology, which, as I understand, is essentially using, again, the language of hidden Markov models to model sequences that in that context would be genes, gene expressions, as I understand. Talking about hidden Markov models and the impact that they had, not necessarily on biology or computational biology, but on large deviations theory. And maybe we can spend a few words about that.
Yes, so when I was trying to get into computational biology, I found that there is this very famous algorithm called BLAST, Basic Local Alignment Search Techniques, that is BLAST. And there's a classic paper by Ofer Zaitouni and Colin Zentuni and next somebody else. So they were using this theory which I didn't understand at all. I mean, I just looked at it and said, what are these guys doing? So then I looked around and I said, what is this theory called? That eventually I came to know it's called large deviation theory. I said, okay, then I need to learn large deviation theory. So there is a very famous book by Dembo and Zaitouni and on large deviation. And I basically read that. And one of the things I do when I'm trying to learn a new subject, I really go into the student mode. I mean, I read the book very thoroughly. If there are homework problems or exercises, I should say, I do all the exercises. I keep a notebook. And so then I taught myself this large deviation theory and enough to get by, so to speak. And then the question was, how do you apply it to Markov processes? And then in this book by Dembo and Zaitouni, they reprised the theory due to Professor Varadan. I think many people in the audience might have heard of Professor Varadan. He's a Nobel Prize winner. And I was doing this work in about 2008 or something like that. And believe it or not, I could actually simplify one of his proofs and even simplify one of his formulas. What Professor Varadan and another person called Domsker, they said there's something called large deviation rate function. And they said, well, the rate function is the solution to this optimization problem. Well, it's not very satisfactory. I mean, it's like you change one problem which you can't solve and replace it by another problem, right? So what I could figure out was how to solve this problem. So I could calculate this rate function very exactly. So that gave me a lot of confidence. And that what was there in that hidden Markov model book. So I don't think that book had a whole lot of impact on biology. I had a very optimistic, rosy view that biologists may read this book. But in the final analysis, it turned out to be too mathematical for them. But it turns out that the same log deviation theory is used in a whole bunch of other areas. Like, for example, in machine learning today, they don't call it large deviation, but you find the same formula coming up over and over again. So it turned out to be a beneficial investment of my time.
Maybe we can actually talk about that. So offline, we were discussing how to pick problems and generally how to develop a taste for research problems in general.
I think there's a large element of luck, but there's no point in pretending that luck does not play a role. Luck plays a huge role. Because remember, when you start a research area, it's not going to fructify in 3, 4 years. So, in some sense, you have to pick a problem which is going to be, quote, hot 3, 4 years later. How do you do that? So, there's a fair bit of luck involved in that. But there's also a case for the expository aspect. So, if you think about a problem and you will convince yourself that this is the way to solve this problem, and then you explain to others why this is a natural way, then others will come around to accepting this as the way to do it. See, one of the nice things in the mathematical type of research we do is quite intellectually honest, unlike some other subjects, in the sense that if you solve a problem efficiently, by and large, people are ready to give you credit. It's not true in other subjects. So if you do a good job of explaining what it is you are doing, you influence other people to think the way you are doing. And then pretty soon you become kind of one of the pioneers in that area. So that's what I have noticed in all the books that I have written on the research areas. But I spend a lot of time on the exposition, not just the research part, but also on the expository part. And not every good researcher does that, I find.
I generally agree. We haven't covered one more book, that's the introduction to compressed sensing, but I just wanted to ask you a follow-up question regarding the role of luck. So given that there is such an important role of luck, how should one confront, if you want, with that?
Well, so for example, the book on compressed sensing is one where my luck didn't hold, you see. Because when I started learning compressed sensing, it was a very hot topic. And 3, 4 years later, when I finished writing that book, people liked the book, but it was no longer a hot topic. So that's fine. So that's the example of something where what I thought would happen didn't actually happen. But now then my last book, I should say let me say latest book, is going to be on non-convex optimization, which is used a lot in neural network training. See, everybody in the world of machine learning talks about stochastic gradient descent, that CAIR algorithm. So I was interested, when does this actually work? I mean, can you prove that it converges when you have a non-convex function? And can you estimate the rate at which it converges? So these were the questions I wanted to ask myself. And I teamed up with a very brilliant probabilist in India called Rajiv Karandikar. And he and I have worked out a pretty complete theory of non-convex optimization. I mean, I have a couple of papers on my own, but most of the papers are with Rajiv. So that's what the book is going to be about. So,
and what is the underpinning?
So the underpinning is stochastic convergence of stochastic processors. See, what happens is, if you look at neural network optimization, now if you look at the chat GPT and all these big models, they have hundreds of billions of parameters, right? So you're not going to be able to calculate the full gradient. So you have some approximate ways of calculating the gradient. And how you calculate the approximate gradient also involves some random choices. So the approximate gradient you get is not only inexact, but it's also random. So what you got to do is to say, all right, I'm trying to run a gradient descent, but the gradient I'm getting is number one, it's wrong, and number two, it's random. Meaning, if I run the same experiment a second time, I get different stochastic gradient. So that was the motivation. And what we were trying to do, Rajiv and I, and one other student, was can we greatly reduce the number of computations? When I say greatly, I'm talking about huge number, maybe a factor of 10,000, something like that. Now, the problem is, as you know, in machine learning, the kind of resources used by the big companies are several orders of magnitude more than what a university has access to. So we in IIT Hyderabad can probably solve problems with 10 million parameters, 100 million parameters. But that's only 3 orders of magnitude less than what the machine learning industry is using. So we have to figure out how to scale up our, either we have to solve real problems, which is very difficult in an academic environment because we don't have that kind of money. And it's not IIT Hyderabad problem. No academic institution can afford 20,000 GPUs, and nobody's going to give you that kind of money. So then the question comes, okay, how do you prove that that your algorithm, which is working very efficiently for 100 million parameters, will continue to work for 100 billion parameters? Now, actual numerical validation is out of the question. So can you do some theoretical analysis? That's what we're working on right now. So it is basically, it's the old saying, necessity is the mother of invention, right?
It is. And actually, I'm quite curious about your stance on the interaction between control and machine learning.
So I think that in some ways, a lot of machine learning is originating from control systems. I think the mistake we have made in as a control theory community, I hope I'm not offending anybody when I say this. When we try to look at machine learning as a control problem, we're still stuck in the old paradigms, LQG. That's not the right paradigm at all. So I think that you have to figure out what is the control problem in machine learning. And I don't think we're anywhere close to that. Having said that, I think controls people are very well equipped to do that because we generally have a knack for the systems viewpoint, much more so than other disciplines. So I think the right control theoretic formulation of machine learning hasn't been found yet. And when it is found, it won't look anything like x star equals ax plus bu. I mean, that's very clear.
Can I ask one follow-up question related to precisely to this question? So as a theoretician, something that bothers me in machine learning is the fact that there seems to be a lot of pepper and salt, in the sense that when I put up an architecture, a large architecture, and I say use an attention block or transformers, etc., everything is kind of assembled in a heuristic way. Again, I am also hoping not to offend anyone. So the question of architecture, so how to design an optimal architecture for a specific task, seems to be an important one. What are your thoughts on this?
No, you're absolutely right on that. If I think back to optimization, not even machine learning, just optimization, let's say 10, 15 years ago, the research community paid a lot of attention to the efficiency of the algorithms. People used to figure out, okay, how many operations, how much storage, how many iterations. Now, one of the characteristics of machine learning today, nobody worries about that. It's like, if you need another 10,000 GPUs, we'll go and get them. So, in that kind of an environment, it's very difficult to strive for optimality or efficiency. So, now specifically talking about transformers, so there are several possible alternative transformer architectures. Which is better? And by and large, the machine learning community's reaction would be, who cares? I mean, this is working. So I don't have time to explore alternatives because my competitor down the street is going to come out with something tomorrow. So I have to publish my thing today. That's not a very healthy scientific atmosphere, even though it's a very good technological atmosphere, if you see the distinction that I'm trying to make. So, like the question you just asked, for a transformer architecture, is this the best we can do? And if the practitioner's answer is, well, this is working, so I'm happy with it, and I can't afford to look at whether something is going to be better because everyone is going to beat me to it. So, I think the role of the funding agencies has to be to encourage the academic community to look at this fundamental question, which obviously will take a long time to answer, even as the technological community is going at a very fast pace. But what has happened is that because all the money is with private industry, in machine learning especially, and funding agencies have no money basically. So it has vastly skewed the research, and I'm not sure that's a very good thing in the long run. I think some very interesting questions are going to get missed out.
Well, in any case, it seems like the energy and water footprint of these algorithms will hit us at some point. So I feel that we will be confronted with such questions sooner or later, let's say.
Yes, I mean, that's the thing that I don't understand, frankly speaking. You're already hitting the limit of energy consumption. Companies are talking about captive nuclear power plants and things like that. But that's not the answer. I mean, that's not the only answer. Side by side, you should also think about the efficiency of your algorithms. Don't run something on 20,000, 50,000 GPUs because it seems to work. You really should ask, do I really need so many GPUs? For example, suppose somebody comes out with a 1 trillion parameter model. You should ask the question, are so many parameters really needed? Can I reduce the number of parameters without sacrificing performance? Now, in control theory, we used to call it the order reduction problem. And that was easy to solve in control theory because we had linearity. There is no linearity in machine learning. But that only means that the specific methods have to be different. It doesn't mean that the question is wrong. It's just that you can't do Hankel norm minimization because that's only good for a linear order reduction problem. So what is the analog of order reduction for a trillion parameter neural network? I think if we start thinking along those lines, we can probably make some impact on the field. Whether we make an impact on the practitioners, I do not know. But I think the research community would react favorably to something like this.
I worked on model reduction myself, and I'm glad that you bring it up. I also made that connection, and I look forward to seeing somebody trying it at some point.
Yes. Well, I'm afraid it's not going to be me because other than raising the question, I don't really want to open too many more fronts. So now I just raise the question and leave it to bright young people like you to follow up or solve the problems.
Let's see. Saga, I'm also mindful of time, and it's been wonderful to spend some time with you. I just wanted to maybe gradually move towards the end of the episode. Normally, we ask our guests advice to future students. I know that we already talked about it before, but what would you suggest to someone who is starting their own career? What's the one thing you wish you would have known?
No, I don't think. I don't think I have any answer in the sense that I don't think I made too many wrong decisions in my life. That's not because I'm a great thinker or anything like that. I think it's mainly because I've been lucky. So let me put it that way. Okay. Therefore, I don't think I can give any advice on what mistakes to avoid because I don't think I've made many. But it is also a case that back when I started my PhD, I finished my PhD in 1969 and started my academic career, life was certainly more relaxed. What has happened is that the ratio of funding in the US, definitely, the ratio of funding to aspirants had become dramatically bad. Meaning, if you adjust for inflation, if you adjust for the number of people applying for grants, the amount of money available now before Trump's cuts was something like 1/10 of what it was in 1965. And now with Trump's cuts, it may be even worse. To give you a simple example, in 1965, when the National Research Foundation first started engineering, they had a budget of $2.5 billion for the American research. When I went to Texas and was looking at computational biology, this was in 2009, so 40 years later, the budget was $6.5 billion. A rise in the factor of 2.5, that's all. And the number of aspirants had grown a lot in that period. There's inflation. The research assistants were costing a lot more. I mean, my first scholarship as a grad student was $250. You don't get anybody for that kind of money today, right? So if you take all these things into account, you find that the money has just become very, very tight. And the other bad thing in the American system, especially, I don't know how it is in Europe, you have all these administrators who are quite literally flogging the young researchers to get money. And that's not a good system at all. So I don't know how to counteract that because that's a systemic problem. But if you have the luxury of ignoring that, the advice I gave in my brief history of graph topology paper, I think it's still good. Read a lot, think a lot, interact with a lot of people, and listen a lot. And then eventually you'll come out with your own research program and you stick to it for a few years. Don't get too sidetracked by what I'll call expedient research. I mean, don't pretend to be interested in some topic just because there's money in it. That happens a lot in the US. Now, a lot of times young people don't have the choice of saying, no, I'm going to stay away from that and do something else. That's why I said if you have the luxury of not doing all that money chasing, then I think that is the recipe. But I fear that increasingly that's going to become impossible if it isn't already.
There's great advice also. Again, the paper is a brief history of the graph topology in 1996 on the European Journal of Control. There's great advice also about this. Incredibly there, you were already, I don't know, foreseeing this problem probably. But you do talk about the role of a theorist and how should a theorist survive in an increasingly quote-unquote applied world. And you bring up the example of the singular value, the composition explained by Bruce Moore in 1981, which I guess at the time was a new tool or something that was not as well known as it is today. And also the role of, for example, differential geometry and its relevance in nonlinear control in 1970s and 1980s. So I guess that can give us hope in this respect.
I do understand that the world has changed a lot, but I don't think I have any wise words to contribute there.
I have one last question that I have to ask, and it's about the future. I know that we talk about non-convex optimization and, well, its role in machine learning and stochastic gradient descent. I was curious to hear your opinion, if you wish, about how the future of control may look like in the next decade or so.
See, I have always maintained that I'm not a control theorist. I'm a systems theorist. There's a big difference. See, a lot of the concepts from system theory are applicable in other domains. Order reduction, controllability, observability, singular value decomposition. Those are all system theoretic concepts. HM theoretic control is a control theoretic concept. So once you get this distinction clear in your head, that what is valuable about our community is not control theory but system theory, then I think you should have that flexibility to retool yourself to the problem at hand. So, for example, if you were to ask me, do you think that any machine learning problem can be viewed as a loop transfer recovery or H infinity optimization? I'll say no chance. Those are very specific techniques tailored to very specific situation. But if you ask the question, how do you minimize the impact of disturbances? How do you reduce the impact of uncertainty? How do you come up with controllers that are as simple as possible, order reduction, as we were talking? Those are all system theoretic concepts. And if we figure out how to formulate those problems in the context of machine learning, we could make an impact if the machine learning community sort of goes back to its roots. And for the reason that you mentioned, I think the machine learning community's current approach of just buying more and more GPUs and consuming more and more energy is going to hit a wall already. If it hasn't hit it already, it will hit it very soon. So they'll have to start addressing these questions, and possibly we can play a role in addressing some of these questions.
So from this perspective, what would you invest on if you were a young researcher today?
I don't know. You're talking about somebody who's planning to retire in 2 years, so I'm not sure what I can talk about. I think that there is actually some system theoretic aspects of machine learning, especially a lot of the algorithmic aspect, but also the implementation aspects. For example, when you want to train a trillion parameter model or a half a trillion parameter model, there's a lot of parameter swapping and memory optimization. A lot of it is done in a fairly ad hoc manner now. Can we at least do that in a more systematic manner? And the advantage of that is, even if you get a 50% reduction, people are happy, because 50% reduction in energy consumption is hundreds of $1 million for a company. So, and that's right now is being done in a very ad hoc manner. And maybe people like us can bring some discipline into that aspect, right? The software engineering part as opposed to the algorithmic part. Now, I'm very guilty of looking at only the algorithmic part. But I think young people should also look at the software engineering part. And the two together, I think they have an opportunity to make a big impact.
Well, Sagar, it's been an honor to have you on the show. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. Thank you so much.
No, it's my pleasure. And I thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you for listening. I hope you liked the show today. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider giving us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, follow us on Spotify, support on Patreon or PayPal, and connect with us on social media platforms. See you next time.